I'm Kirsten Jersick, a resource conservationist with Glacierland RC&D. I'll be moderating today. Jacob Grace will be managing the webinar, and Rachel Baressa will be fielding the questions towards the end. The G-Team consists of agency staff, grazing educators across Wisconsin. We meet quarterly for group education on managed grazing issues and to network with one another. Jacob Grace and Rachel Baressa are currently managing the G-Team. We would like to thank GrassWorks for coordinating the G-Team and SARE for providing funding for this important work. And we invite all of you participants to join our future G-Team meetings. I'd like to put out a huge thank you to all of our presenters for volunteering their time to help educate us today on the importance of managed grazing in birds. I'm just briefly going to announce the speakers, and they'll be introducing themselves in more detail during their presentations. Erin Giese will be our first speaker. She's a senior research specialist with the University of Green Bay. Dave Sample is a conservation biologist with the Department of Natural Resources. Laura Judge is a master's degree candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Chris Wilson is a director at the Audubon Society, and he runs the Audubon Conservation Ranching Program. And Serge Koenig is a conservationist from Sauk County, Wisconsin. So I'd like to, we have 196 people registered for this meeting, which is really exciting. We're very excited about that. You are, I think as Jacob told you, you are muted as you enter the meeting, and we ask that everybody stay muted throughout the meeting. We will be answering questions at the end of the meeting, and we'll go through the process as to how to do that at that time. So Jacob does have you muted and does have your camera turned off on your computer. So we just hope everybody can stay that way. And I will now turn it over to Erin Giese for our first presentation.
Hi, thank you for that lovely introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me. My name is Erin Giese. I work at University of Wisconsin in Green Bay, and most of my work does revolve around birds. My expertise is actually in forest and wetland birds and birds. So next slide, I'll be talking to you guys today about birds in general, why they're important, global avian diversity, and eventually kick it off to your grassland bird experts who will talk after me. So why do birds matter? Why bother caring about birds? Well, like a lot of organisms, they serve really important ecosystem functions in the food web. They provide a lot of services, and I'll be going through those in a little bit, but they're critical components to grassland ecosystems, forests, wetlands, you name it. And they have a long history of being known as, or being used as indicators of environmental issues, like the canary in the coal mine example in the bottom left here on my slide. The presence or absence of certain bird species that are sensitive to pollution or environmental degradation can tell you about the health of an ecosystem. So they can provide important signals to scientists about environmental problems. They also can serve as pest control. For example, a barn swallow can eat 60, that's 60 insects an hour, or 850 insects a day. More impressively, a tree swallow, that's the bird pictured in the bottom right, can eat about 2,000 insects per day during the nesting season, which blew my mind when I stumbled on that fact. And they can also help with farmers in leading to a reduction in crop damage as well. So they're really, that's a critical role, certainly, and it's really helpful to have them. They also can be cleanup crews. Right, is a black vulture. They feed on carrion or dead things, and they can keep our habitats clean. Next slide. Birds also play an important role in our economy. Birding is really considered a sport, and people will travel long distances to watch migratory bird fallout. They'll drive long distances to find a rare bird. So there's a lot of tourism involved. Lots of people like to bird feed. and create nest boxes for their birds in their yard. And then, of course, hunting is extremely popular and useful as well. In terms of ecosystem function, like I mentioned earlier, they also are seed dispersers. So they help plants disperse themselves across the landscape. And then some birds actually serve as pollinators, much like a bee would, which is kind of neat. Next slide. So there's a lot of birds in the world. Estimate from scientists is that there are just a little over 18,000 species. The original number scientists estimated was 10,000, but with the latest genetics capabilities, scientists are finding that species that look similar are actually genetically different. So that's I don't know, that number came out the last couple of years. It really blew my mind. That's a lot of birds in the world, and a little over 2,000 can be found in North America. What you're seeing here, these lines that go across these continents show you where birds are traveling. So, you know, birds can be found on all 7 continents on the earth, and they're always moving around. And so birds will a lot of birds will reside in one area to breed, typically in the summertime. And then after the breeding season, in the case of North America, they typically breed in Canada and northern parts of the United States. And then in the fall, then they migrate south for the winter, and they overwinter in places like the southern US, Central and South America, and then back again, and then they travel back the next year. So Wisconsin provides a really critical area for birds during the breeding season, as well as migration. So some birds will only pass through Wisconsin to migrate, and then other birds will come to Wisconsin just for the winter as well. Next slide. This is a map showing you just how important the Great Lakes ecosystem is in terms of birds in the United States. So this shows you that Wisconsin serves, is really as a critical bird hotspot. So the darker areas on this map show you where the species richness is highest. And there are a few places in the US, but the Great Lakes is certainly one of them. So that's also really fascinating. Next slide. And Wisconsin, as I mentioned, is diverse. There's a lot of birds here. The birds shown here are just a small sample of the birds that you might find in our state. They come in all different sizes, shapes, and colors. Some eat bugs, some eat rodents, some eat other birds. They all live different lives. And in Wisconsin, there have been 454 species found in the state, according to an online database called eBird. And the Wisconsin Breeding Bird Atlas 2 project, completed last year, documented 243 species breeding in Wisconsin. So that's a lot of birds that use our state. And it's really important that we provide adequate habitat for them. Next slide. Unfortunately, and I don't want to go too doom and gloom here, but a really important study came out last year in 2019 called The Decline of North American Avifauna by Kenneth Rosenberg et al. And they found some really alarming information. They reported that since 1970, 2.9 billion birds have disappeared from the United States and Canada, so North America essentially. That's 1 in 4 birds gone, as you can see on this graphic on the right. 2.9 billion. Just let that sink into your head for a moment. That's why I wrote the number at the bottom of my slide to show you how many zeros that 1,900,000,000 birds. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Next slide, which I'll talk about next here. So there's a lot of reasons why bird populations are declining, but the ones I have listed here are some of the key reasons. So there's a lot of habitat loss, and then that's true across all habitats, grasslands included. We're losing habitat for birds and other wildlife due to development, from people, whether those are towns and housing or agriculture, mining, all sorts of different. And the habitat that is there often gets fragmented or cut up. As you can see in the image on Google Earth, it shows you some forest habitats split up because of roads and other things. And that really can create problems for birds. Birds also can collide with wind migration. Invasive species are a problem. These are species that are not native to this region that can disrupt ecosystems. Outdoor cats can also do a number killing birds, as can pesticides. And climate change can also negatively impact birds with changing weather patterns, bigger storm events, fires, and we're also seeing evidence of birds' ranges shifting north and south due to these changing temperatures, which also can change the ecosystems that they live in. Next slide. However, I don't want to be totally doom and gloom here and just mention that, you know, there is hope. Out of the 35 million acres of Wisconsin, a very small portion of the state, the northern parts, is owned by has public land ownerships, meaning there are about 83% of land is privately owned. 83%, that is a really huge number. And that's my key take-home point, is that there's not as much public land. Most of it's forested or is of wetland habitats, but private lands, there's a lot more of that, and that's, you know, really important to make some changes for. Next slide. And that's really important because grassland birds, as you'll learn from Dave and others, are the group of birds that are hurting the most, that are declining the most, and you're never too small to make a difference. And I hope you guys take home a lot of important lessons and information from the next speakers.
Thank you, Erin. Switch to Dave.
Oh, I guess I needed to unmute myself. Can everybody hear me now? Jacob, am I on?
Yes. Yep,
Okay.
I can hear you. Thank you, Dave.
Yep. Okay, thank you, Erin, for that excellent introduction and lead in to the other talks. As Kirsten said, my name is Dave Sample, and I work with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the Natural Heritage Conservation Bureau as a conservation biologist. I've been there for about 5 years, and prior to that I had 30 years as a grassland bird researcher in our former research bureau. And I'm thankful for Kirsten for the invitation to speak today. As my intro slide says here, I'm talking about grassland birds and grazing in Wisconsin. I'm going to do quite a bit just about general introduction to grassland birds here, but there'll be some issues related to management and grazing in particular. Next slide, please. First of all, just what are grassland birds? Well, they're birds of grasslands. That's the easiest way to put it. But we're going to be talking today about what we refer to as obligate grassland birds. And these species, as the slide says, require grasslands for most or all parts of their breeding cycles. And importantly, ones that don't require non-grassland features, such as trees or shrubs, or you could add buildings or wetlands or something else. These are birds that are restricted to or able to survive just in grass habitats. Next slide, please. This is a list of the 16 obligate grassland bird species in Wisconsin. And it's quite a diverse group in terms of the families of birds represented, all the way from raptors such as northern harrier and short-eared owls through gallinaceous species such as the prairie chicken, shorebirds such as the upland sandpiper, and a whole host of perching birds, songbirds from a variety of families. And I've indicated on the slide here, several are listed as state threatened, and also all the birds with a plus before their names are on our species of greatest conservation need. list. So they're of some sort of conservation need or other conservation concern. Grasslands are not as diverse across the world as forested or wetland habitats are. So if we were looking at forest bird species, we'd see a much longer list here. But it doesn't mean they're not important. It's just it's a lower number of species. Next slide, please. Erin did a good job of talking about this 3 billion birds report, which made a very big splash this last winter. And published in Science magazine, but picked up by news outlets all over the place. I'm pointing out here that of the different sorts of habitat guilds for birds, so forest, wetland, urban, so forth, grassland birds have experienced the steepest decline, a decline of 53% since 1970 in the number of grassland birds over time. So that's totals 720 million birds. And as Erin said, we've generally lost 1 out of every 4 birds in the continent. But if you zero in on grassland species, we've lost 3 out of 4. So here we're indicating the loss of 3 and 4 meadowlarks since 1970 in the continent. So it's a startling number and a cause for great conservation concern. Next slide, please. This is just one little individual example to give a little more hands-on feel here, the bobolink. And if you look at the lower right-hand graph, this is a plot or map. This is the region for which these trends are being estimated, includes the southern 3/4 of Wisconsin. The trend here shows that starting in 1966, there were an average of about 45 bobolinks per survey route out of roughly 70 routes in Wisconsin. Fast forward to 2012, and we're down to just about 5 or 6 bobolinks per route statewide. And if this isn't a precipitous decline, I don't know what is. We are way down in numbers, and the bobolink is a good example here. Next slide. Erin did a good job of giving a framework for causes of declines in birds. I'm going to zero in here a little bit more grassland species. Erin mentioned habitat loss and alteration. That's probably the biggest one here in Wisconsin, partly because former prairie habitats are the ones that we've completely altered for agriculture. So we have less than 1% of our native prairie left in Wisconsin. And birds have had to adapt to that by adapting to agricultural habitats. There's been a lot of change within those habitats. Erin mentioned fragmentation, that's a big one. Housing development is part of the fragmentation picture. Regarding former grasslands that are not farmed, the encroachment by woody species and conversion to either shrublands or woodlands is a huge issue in grassland habitat loss. Predator populations, as indicated by the hungry raccoon here, are a major issue. Predation rates are very large for grassland birds. And we've just seen a large conversion in the type of farming from the grass-based grass hay pasture farming era in the mid-1900s now to being dominated by row crops such as corn, soybeans, and alfalfa. And these represent a real intensification of agriculture. Not only that, most of these birds are migratory, almost all of them, and so they face threats away from Wisconsin. Next slide, please. This is a graph illustrating some of the degree of habitat change in Wisconsin. This is the acreage of pasture in Wisconsin and millions of acres over time. So you can see from settlement times where we just were beginning to get pasture up through our peak in the mid-1900s of over 4.5 million acres of pasture. And that pasture was generally not as intensively managed as what we're managing today. But now, as of 2017 Census of Agriculture, we're just over 1 million acres, back where we were in the late 1800s. So we've really lost a lot of grass-based agriculture in Wisconsin over time. And this is just looking at pasture alone. Next slide, please. I referred to the migratory issue. This slide illustrates 3 different migratory strategies and the fact that these birds are facing challenges as well as opportunities away from Wisconsin. So we start on the left with the Henslow sparrow, which is a short distance migrant nesting in a small range in Midwest and Northeast, and then staying entirely within the US boundary for the winter. The blue there down in the Gulf states. Brown is breeding, I should mention, and yellow is migratory, blue is winter. The grasshopper sparrow in the middle there is considered a mid-range migrant, breeds in a large range in the US and then spends the winter in the Gulf states all the way down to southern Central America and the Caribbean islands. And bobolink on the right is a true long-distance migrant, nesting in a large range in the northern part of the US and southern Canada, and then wintering all the way down in Central and Southern South America. So there's a lot of issues a small bird has to deal with migrating that great distance, and bobolinks in particular are known to be crop pests. They eat rice, so they are persecuted for that, and these are challenges that we can't ignore as we focus in on what's going on in our breeding range here. Next. A little bit about introducing you to grassland birds in Wisconsin, and I want to organize this by their habitat requirements and illustrate that it represents a real continuum of habitat structural needs. These birds, like most birds, respond to the habitat structure. How tall is it? How dense is it? Is it woody? Is it herbaceous? Is there water? Is there not? These birds, of course, are looking ranging from short to tall grasses. This slide here shows in the central up there, the middle bird, those 2 birds, really short to no vegetation. On soil. And then I have the western meadowlark in the bottom center, the grasshopper sparrow, one of my favorites, in the lower left, and the upland sandpiper in the upper right. And these are birds that all, again, like relatively short and sparse grassland vegetation. And as such, they, as we'll see in a minute, do fairly well, or have the potential to do fairly well in grazed systems. Next slide, please. As we move up the height range, we get into what are called the midgrass species. In some ways, these are more generalist. They have a broad amplitude of habitat structure they can tolerate, but they tend to center in on the mid-range heights, and this is the savanna sparrow on the bottom left, the bobolink on the upper left, the dickcissel in the center, which is another long-distance migrant, spends the winter in Venezuela largely, and then the eastern meadowlark, the more common meadowlark here in Wisconsin on the right. Next slide, please. These are the tallgrass species. There are fewer of them than there are the other groups. We have the state-threatened Henslow sparrow on the left and the sedgerin on the right. These species also tend to like not only dense and tall live vegetation, but they need a lot of litter or dead vegetation in their habitats to make their nests. And so these birds typically don't occur in pastures. Next slide, please. We can arrange these birds on a continuum of habitat structure, habitat preference, and that's what this slide tries to do. So the main axis here on the x-axis is from short and sparse vegetation to tall and dense. And these birds arrange themselves, as I've shown here, all the way from horned lark and vesper sparrow that do well in bare soil to Henslow sparrow sedgerin that want pretty dense and thick vegetation. Also, we have the litter layer, the dead vegetation gradient on the y-axis from very little on the bottom to the lot on the top. You can also relate this continuum to management practices such as fire frequency on the right, but I want to draw your attention to the grazing continuum on the bottom x-axis. Where heavy to moderate grazing will lower and shorten the vegetation height, preferring those species. to no or very low grazing intensity on the right, allowing more habitat structure, more vegetation, more litter layer for those species. And soil moisture, of course, is another variable that I added on here. You could add others as well, but I have prairie chicken there listed by itself because it takes use in its life cycle of both short, medium, and tall vegetation structure. So it's sort of a unique species in that way. Next slide. If we think about where we have wiggle room to work with these bird species, I've drawn the bigger left-hand circle to show the group of species where we really have room to work with in grazing systems to benefit both the grazers and grassland birds. The birds up in the upper right circle really are going to not benefit from grazing in general, and so we would expect those birds to benefit from areas that are left ungrazed as refuges, nesting refuges during the breeding season. Next slide, please. Obviously, grazing is a grassland management tool. And why is grassland management important to birds? Well, partly because grassland habitats themselves need disturbance in this latitude and longitude to prevent them from becoming woods. Management is the thing that we use to impact vegetation structure and a whole variety of other variables that birds respond to. Where, the what, why, or why, what, where, it occurs at whatever the management unit level is, and in this case, it'd be the pasture or the paddocks or the group of paddocks. And then the other questions, when do we manage, how often do we manage, how intense should we manage? Notice those questions are all sort of in the, well, it's a good question, it all depends. And in fact, management with grazing for birds does all depend. It depends on what are your management goals? What species are you trying to benefit if birds are a management goal of yours? And the responses of species are variable depending on that species ecology. So I'm trying to drive home the point that this is an art in terms of how to manage grasslands for birds, and it all depends. Next slide, please. Here is a slide of the phenology or the timing seasonally of active bobolink nests in Wisconsin by date. So you can see they start nesting late in the first week of May, they peak in the early part of June, and they continue nesting all the way until close to the end of July. So even though grassland habitats need disturbance to be maintained on the landscape, grassland birds need relatively light or no disturbance during the breeding season in order to successfully nest. So this is one of the primary nuts that has to be cracked in terms of how to benefit both grazing and birds, is how do we integrate the timing of the nesting cycle with grazing management. Next slide, please. Well, okay, I forgot to set my timer. So this is a list, I'm not going to go into great detail, of variables that impact grassland birds. Point is, there's a lot of them. So the grazer, as the artist, as you might say, has a lot of dials to tweak, and they include things like stocking rate. What's the livestock class? By that I mean, are these milking cows? Are these beef steers? What is the livestock class? What's the grazing type? Is it a managed intensive grazing? Is it continuous grazing, simple rotational? Seasonality is hugely important, as we just saw. When are we grazing? Is it during the shoulder seasons or right smack in the middle of the breeding season? How long do grazing bouts last? How much are we resting in between grazing events? Do we have refuges from grazing or not? What's the watering system as that affects cattle behavior, trampling vegetation near the water? How much vegetation are we leaving as residual when the cows come off the pasture? Next slide, please. How big is the pasture? What's the surrounding landscape? If you have a small pasture system surrounded by woods, you're less likely to get good grassland bird use than you are if you're in a big pasture system in a large, open, preferably grassy landscape. What's the vegetation composition? Birds do respond to some degree to whether grasses are cool or warm season, whether there's a lot of forbs or not. What's the soil type and quality is huge, and of course soil moisture, which growth, and how quickly cattle can be moved from one paddock to another, which of course influences vegetation height. And the biggie, of course, that's unpredictable is weather, which determines a lot with grazing, the grass growth. Next slide. This is just, I have just a couple more slides here. This is just an example of one of the direct impacts, the most obvious direct impact of grazing on grassland birds, and that is hoof meets eggs or hoof meets nestlings. And when that happens, the hoof is going to win. So trampling rates are key, and trampling losses, trampling rates are a function of the number of cattle you have times the number of days the cattle are in that pasture and how big is that pasture. So here's an example of a happy bird that this species has 4 nests in this pasture, and there's a small number of cattle that are in the pasture for not very long, or a very small number that are in the pasture for longer. But the probability of a hoof stepping on a nest is relatively low in this light stocking rate scenario. Next slide. Here's a case of either a higher stocking rate or a lower stocking rate with longer duration of cattle being in the pasture. And here's the same number of bird nests, and just due to the mathematics and probability of hoof meeting nest, a lot more nests are impacted. It's just simple math, really. And here's our unhappy bird because, gosh, they nested here, and then the cattle come in, and the hoof always wins. So it's not rocket science. Next slide, please. So here's my final slide, just showing maybe how can a hypothetical grazing system interact with a nesting bird. Here we have again that bobolink nesting phenology from early May to late July. Maybe the grazer can come in before May, maybe overwinter cattle, lightly graze early in the season, maybe back off with grazing, have a very light stocking rate during the breeding season, and then come back and graze at higher rates or make hay after the breeding season, or have a nesting refuge available during the breeding season so that bobolinks have a place where they can nest undeterred during the breeding season. So again, timing matters. It's a lot of art and sort of tweaking here, but I think it is possible for grazing systems and birds to coexist. So thank you very much for your time.
All right, I'll dive right in. Can you hear me, Jacob?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right, thanks. I am Laura. I am a graduate student in the Agroecology master's program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And my research over the past 2.5 years has encompassed plant community response to grazing on public lands and the grassland bird habitat on both public and privately owned grasslands. So I'm going to dive into some more detail about some of the practices that Dave was just hinting at. I just want to define working grasslands for the purpose of my presentation as pastures and hayfields. Next slide. So before I hit those tips, I want to again come back to Wisconsin's grassland acreage and think about how that breaks down. So out of the 35 million acres that comprise Wisconsin, the grasslands break down into about 100,000 acres of state-owned grasslands. So that's owned by the Department of Natural Resources and managed by them for goals like promoting biodiversity, wildlife habitat, native plants. So that encompasses most of the publicly owned grasslands in the state. Then when we look at privately owned grasslands in our state, we've got about 4 million acres in hay, 1.1 million acres in pasture, and at least 200,000 acres in CRP or Conservation Reserve Program land. So that's about 5 million acres of working grasslands, CRP in addition to that. So as you can see, by comparing that state-owned grassland number to the privately owned grassland number, that the scale of privately owned grasslands in our state, especially including those working grasslands, is very meaningful in terms of our grassland habitat. Next slide, please. So as Dave was mentioning, yeah, grassland birds, they nest on the ground. And some species, like the one on the left, they're really good at hiding their nests from predators. Hopefully you can see that nest in the picture on the left. The picture on the far right there is a species that builds its nest up off the ground a little as a strategy to avoid predators. But neither of these strategies are helping them avoid cattle hooves or mower blades for hay cutting. So it just results in that with typical modern farm management, nest success or reproductive success of these birds on our working is generally low. So what might we be able to do about that? Next slide, please. The first tip I want to share with you is the nesting season refuge that Dave has introduced for us. So this applies to both grazed land and hay land, and it involves leaving a portion of grassland unharvested between April 25th and August 1st. And this is because our grassland bird nests are generally active and vulnerable during this time period. So you might be wondering, how much area should I be setting aside and where would that best be placed on my farm if I own a farm? The best answers for that are that there's no minimum size, but that bigger is better. And ideally 20 to 30% of the grassland area on a farm could be set aside in a nesting refuge. And these could be located anywhere on the farm, but farther from woody edges is better because there are more predators closer to these pasture edges or hedgerows or woodlots. Now, if waiting to harvest until August 1st seems too long, delaying to harvest until early or mid-July is also beneficial. The April to 25th to August 1st is just the ideal time frame. So this is a pretty simple solution, but of course it's not an easy solution at all because it involves loss of forage yield, includes both forage quantity and quality on that land that's set aside. And in general, you could expect at least 50% of the forage yield on that land in a refuge to be lost due to that practice. A little bit of good news is that there is some evidence to suggest that land in a nesting refuge returns to normal forage yields when normal grazing is practiced again the following season. So that would be shifting the nesting refuge around, and there's no forage yield loss the following season. Next slide. The second tip is leaving a high residual height. So this applies to rotational grazing specifically. Residual height just referring to the height of the plants that left in the pasture when cattle are moved to the next paddock. Ideally, that's 8 inches or taller. 6 inches or taller is also good. It's kind of like the nesting refuge. Harvesting later is better there. Here, it's taller is better. So 6 to 8 is good. Higher than 8 is great. And this could be done in addition to a nesting refuge or instead of a nesting refuge potentially. Next slide. Tip number 3 is using a long rest interval. So this again applies to rotational grazing, and we're allowing 35 or 40 or more days of rest before regrazing paddocks. And this is because 40 days allows time for a complete nesting cycle, also otherwise known as successful reproduction of some bird species. So 40 days is ideal, but if that's not possible, then again, the rule of thumb is longer is better. I have heard of a mob grazing farmer who does 60-day rest intervals sometimes. So this could even be kind of baked into certain grazing practices that people are already doing on the landscape. Next slide. And the last tip, tip number 4, that Dave alluded to is using a lower stocking rate. So defining an animal unit as 1,000 pounds. And this applies to rotational or continuous grazing. These numbers I'm giving are in 1.5 animal units. For reference, 1.5 animal units is about the size of your average Holstein cow. So if that helps you visualize, the ultralight stocking rate at 4 acres per Holstein cow, light at 3 acres, moderate at 2 acres per 1.5 animal units or Holstein cow. And again, we're kind of giving this range here, and the rule of thumb is lighter is better. And of course, this requires a certain amount of land, so that's going to be the biggest limiting factor for this practice. Next slide. So to conclude, working grasslands are important to birds due to the large amount of acreage that we have in the state. And improving nest success on this land is possible using these conservation-minded management strategies that I just talked about. And I want to mention too that this will look different at every farm. The right strategies or combination of strategies will be kind of dependent on each farm and context. And any of that is helpful and it's meaningful, and it represents everybody working together to create a vibrant and biodiverse landscape. So the lingering question probably on everyone's mind is, how do we pay for these practices? Like I mentioned, with the nesting season refuge involves a pretty significant loss of forage yield. From what I know right now, there are limited funding opportunities that apply directly to these practices. And I think it's well worth having a conversation with your local NRCS staff person or conservation district folks to ask about potential conservation funding for these practices. And I definitely see there's some synergy between these practices and pollinator-friendly practices. For example, the no-mow suggested window for monarch butterfly conservation is from May 1st to October 1st for most of Wisconsin, and that overlaps almost completely with our ideal nesting refuge period. So there's a lot of synergy between these conservation topics, and it's worth having conversations about how we can look at conservation funding pools to leverage them. But regardless of that, if we can't figure out a way to get paid to do these practices, maybe there's still a way to make them pay. And our next presenter will be looking at this topic from the marketing angle. Thank you.
All right. Well, my name is Chris Wilson. You guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks, Chris.
Okay. Very good. I'm going to get started. Jacob, be ready to flip through these pretty fast because I've got quite a few slides, and I usually flip through pretty quickly. So on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about the Audubon Conservation Ranching Program, which is actually a market-based approach to grassland bird conservation. And I'm going to discuss how Audubon came about this approach and what it looks like from a standpoint of actually managing habitat for grassland birds, but also how we create a certification in the marketplace to drive incentives for grassland conservation out on private land. So the purpose of this program really is to reverse grassland bird population declines by restoring and enhancing grassland habitat on millions of acres. Next slide. You guys have seen this. We've talked about it. Grassland birds, of all of the different suites of birds mentioned in that study, grassland birds have declined greater than any other, with 53% decline in the last 50 years, which is pretty horrendous. Next. So Audubon was looking at the big picture of what's happening across the landscape with grassland birds and really recognized the fact that the strategies that we've been employing over the last 50 years have clearly not been working. So we're not going to save grassland birds by trying to buy up land or paying farmers and ranchers to do certain practices on their land. There's not enough money to do that. And so the idea was to use a ranch certification to actually empower consumers to incentivize good grassland stewardship on farms and ranches. Next. And we're doing that by enlisting and assisting America's ranchers. So these people that have been managing grassland landscapes for generations are the people that we need to work directly with if we're going to have an impact across these millions of acres. Next. So grassland birds are facing a crisis. So how can we achieve significant conservation at a scale that's large enough to reverse these population declines? Next. So the key points here is we've got to make the connections. These are really important points. First of all, the vast majority of grasslands are privately owned, as we've already discussed. The fate of grassland birds is dependent on those farms and ranches. Economic forces tend to drive land use change. And this one's big. Conservation types don't always make this connection, but habitat loss is inextricably linked to our food system. You know, the way that we purchase cattle and the way that cattle use the land, including the feed that we raise to feed cattle in feedlots, hay to feed cattle out on pasture. All these things relate to our food system. So ultimately, we've got to make that connection. Consumers are becoming increasingly conscious of how that food is raised, and informed consumers can really have an impact. Next. So grasslands need grazers. This is an important point. A lot of people feel like the best thing we can do for grassland birds is to fence it off and keep all grazing animals off grasslands so that the birds can have it all to themselves, right? Unfortunately, that is not the way it works. Okay, grasslands evolved for millennia in the presence of grazing animals. And that regular disturbance is essential to maintaining that grassland structure that whole suite of bird species requires that you saw in that graph, that diagram that David presented earlier. Next. So it turns out that cattle can actually mimic the role of bison, the large herbivore that originally shaped these grassland ecosystems. And they could do that in a way that actually does a lot of good things, not just for bird habitat, but it can actually restore water cycles, plant growth, rebuild soils, and really create this diverse mosaic of habitat that the Great Plains, for specifically, used to look like. It used to be a mosaic of different habitat types as bison and fire interacted with across the landscape. And that's more of what we want to try to replicate. So go ahead. So Audubon is using a market-based approach to basically connect bird-friendly livestock management practices to consumer demand for healthy food and environmental sustainability. Next. And to create the mechanism where that demand, as consumers select products that come from Audubon certified ranches, that demand then will fuel more ranches to become Audubon certified, thus incentivizing better habitat protection on more and more acres across the middle part of the country. Next. So the Audubon certification basically connects the consumer to the rancher, and all of those things in between, from the pollinators to the bird conservation, the prairie ecosystem health, all of those things are positively impacted by our program because of the fact that we actually work with ranchers directly to manage their land specifically for bird habitat, and they get certified specifically as bird friendly. Next. So the Audubon certification, call it the Green Seal, is really the premier certification on products that are having positive impacts on grassland bird habitat. And like I said, it's doing a lot of things beyond just bird habitat. When you manage these systems properly, you can have benefits on all sorts of things across the ecosystem. Next. So briefly, and I could go through this for quite some time, but I won't, but our certification has a set of program standards that must be met by a third-party auditor that comes in and actually certifies these ranches for us. They fall into 4 general categories: habitat management, forage and feeding, animal health and welfare, and environmental sustainability. Next. So each we actually have eco-regional protocols. So we have kind of an umbrella protocols or standards that cover all of the ranches and all of the regions in our program. And then wherever we work, we develop a specific set of habitat protocols and a specific bird species target list for each individual region in which we work. And that's what ranchers use when we work with them to develop the habitat management plan for each ranch. Next. So habitat management plans, either an Audubon staff person or a partner biologist will work with the rancher to develop these habitat management plans. Basically, it lays out all the things they're going to do on their ranch to provide habitat for the target grassland birds. It can include a lot of things. It needs to talk about what they're doing from a standpoint of grazing practices, what approach they're using. A lot of our ranches use some sort of a regenerative grazing approach, something like a sort of short duration, high intensity, long time between disturbance approach, which tends to create that patchiness, which we like to see on the landscape. But every ranch is different, every region is different. There's no set, here's how every ranch must graze in our program. Next. Forage and feeding, basically we don't allow feedlots. We are grass-fed, grass-finished more or less in our protocols, but basically you cannot feed grain. Right now you can feed a very minimal amount of grain, but we're actually eliminating that. So it's going to be basically no grain. Animals can only eat grass and other natural forage as part of their diets. Next. We've got several protocols related to health and welfare, including no antibiotics, no growth hormones, etc. Next. In the habitat management plan itself, we stipulate how they're going to protect riparian areas, eliminate or greatly reduce nutrient application, eliminate GMOs, all the things that tend to have negative impacts. And one of the ways we do that with ranchers is have workshops in different parts of the country where we bring in experts to help show them how to do these types of practices and management approaches that can eliminate all those things. Next. And we monitor every ranch in our program for birds. Some of them we monitor vegetation, and we're going to start monitoring soil on all of our ranches in the next 2 years. Next. We've seen some early indications in Missouri specifically that biodiversity and bird density is increased dramatically when we implement these habitat management plans and follow our bird-friendly management protocols. Next. I just wanted to mention the way this works, the way this market-based approach works is you've got to have markets and you've got to have brands that sell beef with the Audubon seal. So we've got 3 or 4 or 5 key market partners. If you actually want to order bird-friendly beef through our program, go to Blue Nest Beef. That would be one you should write down, bluenestbeef.com or Corner Post Meats. Google any one of those and you can have it shipped straight to your door, and you can support our program and provide more habitat every time you eat beef. Next. So here's what it looks like today from a standpoint of ranches. We're actually up to about 95 ranches. We're up to about 2.4 million acres across 13 states. As you can see, we're not in Wisconsin yet. We very likely will expand into the Great Lakes states, into Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, possibly Illinois in the next year or two, but that requires a lot of capacity and partnership development, and we are open to that. We've had some early discussions, so stay tuned on that. But in the meantime, if you live in Wisconsin, you can support our program by purchasing beef from one of those retailers I mentioned. Next. And that is all I've got. This is my last slide. If you want to learn more about our program, go to audubon.org/ranching, and you can actually find a list of retailers on there as well. So I appreciate the time today. I know there's a lot to cover here, and if you are interested, send me an email if you have specific questions. I'm happy to answer them. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Serge, can we hear you?
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, so mine's going to be pretty shortened. I was trying to figure out, so my name is Serge Koenig. I work for Sauk County Conservation Department out of Baraboo. And we really advocate for rotational grazing, obviously, in our county. And I was trying to find a way to emphasize birds in one of our pasture walks that we organize once a month throughout the grazing season. And, you know, it was important for me from a standpoint of there's a reason people live out in the countryside. And a lot of times it's not to hear tractors roaring left and right, but a lot of times it's the calm and the peace and the wildlife and the bird life that come along with country living. And so I was trying to figure out a way to make that connection with our pasture walks, and I stumbled upon this and I thought it worked well. And so maybe you can show me the next slide. So here's what our flyer looked like. It was a pasture walk for the birds. And obviously my primary angle was to kind of draw a crowd would be the fact that, you know, tree swallows and birds eat a lot of insects that cause problems to our livestock. And so that was the angle that I was using. But obviously I was also after a deeper angle of that deeper appreciation for wildlife and birds included. And so this is what that looked like. Next slide. So I've already mentioned this one. It's more, again, it's fly control, and there's that spiritual component, that deeper sense of place and belonging and peace and whatever you want to call it. I don't care what you call it, but it's somewhere deep in the recesses of our minds and in our hearts. And so that's what I was really going after with this pasture walks. Next slide. So what I did was I just tested people's knowledge. So this happened to be where we were in the barn. It was a windy day and it was hard to hear anything outside. So we went inside and I took out the Audubon app and basically I played the grassland bird songs just to test people's knowledge for fun, and also just to see where people were at as far as their knowledge of grassland birds. These are things that they hear on a regular basis, but maybe you tune out, you know, after a while you kind of tune things out, and I wanted to see what their knowledge base was on it. So I would play it and I would ask someone, hey, what is that bird? And inevitably somebody knew or had a good guess, but as you would kind of somewhat expect, you know, many didn't know what they were, but I played some real obvious ones that almost everybody knew. But it was kind of a good way of hooking them into tuning into listening to these songs while you're walking about, moving pastures, moving your cattle to different pastures, checking on pasture, or just going about doing your chores outside. It was my way of, next time you hear that, that's what that is, or go take a look. And so that was really well received and it worked really well. I just took my son's speaker from home, paired it with my phone and played the songs, and it went over well. Next slide. And one of the things that the host in this situation, it was Peter Kinsman was the host here. He built a bunch of birdhouses, tree swallow birdhouses, and I had copies of those plans that I handed out to people and then they could see it, touch it, feel it while we were there, and then they could see it in the pastures. And in this situation, he just mounted them to fiberglass poles far enough above that we could maybe keep predation down. And so people could see that and where we placed them, and we talked about placement of them and the importance of them. And we had quite a diverse group of people show up for this one. This drew a lot of people. I felt like just the birds. It was just a different angle, and maybe people were hungry for that. I don't know, but it drew a lot of people. I think we had 70 people or so show up for this one. Okay, next. That's it.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Serge, and a big thank you to all of our speakers today. Kirsten, I'll defer to you here, but I think we're at a good time to switch from the formal portion of our webinar over to the discussion section.